The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
It's not often that I can come to you, the David Pakman Show audience, and say, hey, Donald Trump accomplished something. Donald Trump set some kind of record. Donald Trump has done something historic that we can talk about. But I can do that today. Donald Trump has finally accomplished something historic in his presidential campaign. He has managed to rack up 0 major newspaper endorsements. This is a first for any major party nominee in American history. Now, I'm not overstating the importance of newspaper endorsements. Newspaper endorsements, they probably don't really change too many voters' minds, but it still does tell us something when not a single major newspaper has endorsed Donald Trump. Jack Pitney is a professor of government at California's Claremont McKenna College. He said to the Wrap, quote, "It's significant. The cumulative effect of all these defections could have an impact on moderate Republicans." Now, let's give you some context. In 2012, 16 of what are considered the major newspaper endorsements went to Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee. 16 major newspapers didn't endorse anybody, and 28 major newspapers endorsed then sitting President Barack Obama. And we've covered the decisions made by individually traditionally conservative newspapers as well. And there are conservative papers that have endorsed Republicans for decades, 40 years in many cases. I think some of them even something like 60 years. And they have broken with tradition and instead have endorsed Hillary Clinton, or at the very least have said, we're not endorsing Hillary, but don't vote for Trump. So, for example, you've got the Dallas Morning News, which endorsed every single Republican nominee since 1940. We're talking about 76 years here. They were so appalled by the idea of President Donald Trump that they introduced a Clinton endorsement with the caveat, we don't come to this decision easily. This newspaper has not recommended a Democrat for the nation's highest office since before World War II. If you're counting, that's more than 75 years and nearly 20 elections. You've got the Cincinnati Enquirer editorial board, which broke from a nearly 100-year-long tradition of backing Republicans to support Hillary Clinton, telling its readers, quote, this is not a traditional race, and these are not traditional times. And then you have the Arizona Republic, which also endorsed Hillary Clinton. The last time that the Arizona Republic, this is so insane, it sounds almost unbelievable. 1890 was the last time, Pat, that the Arizona Republic endorsed someone other than a Republican.
And you've made your point. To add one more to that list, USA Today, which usually stays out of this kind of thing, they haven't endorsed a president in 34 years. They didn't choose to endorse Hillary, but they basically said, don't vote for Trump. Yeah, USA Today, not traditionally a paper, a publication that endorses at all. So this is really not good for Trump. Now, here's the thing. Let's view this, okay? If you are a non-Trump supporter, you would see this and you would say, that will definitely convince everyone not to vote for Donald Trump, right? But if you are a Trump supporter, you would see this and you would say, no newspapers are endorsing Donald Trump. All the more reason to vote for him. It means that the liberal media is scared. That's the rationale that a lot of Trump supporters will put into play. And even with the sexual assault allegations, which are just flowing freely like a waterfall of Niagara Falls, they say, these are trumped up charges. Bill Clinton's much worse. This is all just meant to hurt Trump. And my support of him has been renewed now. And there are many conservative papers, too. Rupert Murdoch runs quite a few, including the Wall Street Journal. Right. And even they aren't endorsing Trump. Yeah, it's historic in terms of what it represents. I don't care. I've said many times, I don't know that endorsements do much at all. I think taken in total, if you said all of the endorsements in total for a candidate, they probably do something. Do they move the needle? You know, at this point in our electoral vote system, we're talking about a few voters in a few states that are ultimately going to decide whether Trump ekes out a win, whether Hillary wins by a modest margin, or whether Hillary Clinton wins by a historic margin. And I don't know to what extent these endorsements matter.
Trump also, I will note, has no endorsements or votes from any living president, right? People who have done the job before that are alive, none of them have endorsed Donald Trump, nor do they plan to vote for Donald Trump, as near as we can tell. And we had news about George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. Initially, they were staying out, and then reports that at least George H.W. Bush is going to be voting for Hillary Clinton. I'm not totally sure whether that's been proven or not. Kind of doesn't matter, Pat, because the big picture message is there are former Republican presidents who don't want to be anywhere near Trump or any of this campaign, missing from the convention, missing from endorsements. They don't want anything to do with him.
Yeah, the question now is who is supporting him among, people in Congress, like elected officials. There's very few.
And what's funny is I don't even know if I did tell you this. Yeah, after the Trump audio leaked over last weekend, a bunch of Republicans unendorsed Trump, and some of them have stuck with it, right? John McCain said, I'm not voting for Trump. That's it, period. John Huntsman and Mitt Romney, so many people, a lot of people backing away from Trump altogether. There are a few whose names I won't even mention because they're clearly such political opportunists that they don't even deserve me mentioning them on the show. They had originally endorsed Trump. The Pussygate audio leaked, and they said, oh, I'm no longer endorsing Trump and or not voting for him. But then they came back to Trump after the second debate. What's more weaselly than that, Pat? I mean, is your view on Trump changing so drastically that every few days you have to make a public pronouncement? These are just people calculating, am I better off being on the list of Trump friends or foes as of how the wind is blowing this morning? It's pathetic.
Yeah, you've got to make your position and stick to it.
Yeah.
Through high times and low times, you're going to get a lot more respect from the public out of that.
I would respect going down with the ship than unendorsing and then endorsing and explaining why you initially endorsed and explaining why you unendorsed and now why you've re-endorsed. Just commit to going down with the ship if it goes down, or sailing to victory if that's what ultimately happens. I've got a great documentary recommendation for you today. I saw this a couple of months ago. Top Spin, okay? This is a 2014 full-length documentary. It is about table tennis, maybe known to you colloquially as ping pong. But I learned from the documentary that the proper name for the sport is table tennis, and it follows a number of table tennis athletes on their road to the 2012 Summer Olympics. It's 3 young American table tennis players, and it is absolutely fascinating. I was never hugely into table tennis. I'm comfortable calling it table tennis now. I used to always say ping pong, but I'll call it table tennis now. My dad has a table tennis table, I guess is what it's called, in his basement, and sometimes I'll play. I enjoy it, but I was never really into the sport, although I did find those videos interesting where the players are like 10 feet back seemingly from the table smacking the ball. In watching this documentary, I learned, number one, a lot more about the sport, and the sport is fascinating. But more interestingly, number two, many of the best table tennis players start really, really young. But it's not casual, right? You see the training, you see them getting pulled out of school to spend hours practicing and training intensely with coaches. You see the travel, you see all of the drama that goes on, which probably exists with most sports, no matter what sport it is. And the documentary is endlessly fascinating. Have you heard of this one, Pat?
I haven't. I'm really not too big into table tennis myself.
Yeah, no, I'm not hugely into it either, but just seeing this world is fascinating. I'm not hugely into curling, for example, but I bet if there was a curling documentary, and there probably is one, there's a good chance that I'd be interested in the documentary because I'm just interested in seeing there's an entire world there. I watched a documentary recently. This is my documentary recommendation for Top Spin, but I'll mention recently I watched a documentary about Magic the Gathering, the card game. It's like a role-playing card game that producer Lewis was hugely into. I could not care less about Magic the Gathering. I don't know if it's a mage or an orc or you've tapped mana. I don't know anything about it. But just seeing how into it these people are in the tournaments, etc., it's absolutely fascinating.
It makes sense too, because there's a lot of people who like watching like sports documentaries because it's a nice story about like someone starting from nothing and gradually getting better.
Yeah.
But they're not interested in sports themselves.
Yep, no doubt about it. And that applies to the 30 for 30 series, which is always in some way related to sports, although sometimes less directly. Like the Two Escobars is one where it talks about the Colombian soccer team, but really it's about Pablo Escobar and the control that the major cocaine dealer had over so many areas of life, including soccer. And those are really, really good and appeal to a lot of people who are not hugely into sports individually. So to restate, the documentary is Top Spin. It's on Netflix. And of course, you can check out this and all of my recommendations at davidpakman.com/recommendations. We've got a hell of a show for you today, and I'm glad you're with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Carlos Rivera. Carlos, thank you so much for being a supporter and a member of the David Pakman Show. You make the show possible. You can join Carlos and get all the great member benefits at davidpakman.com/membership. Why don't we take a few phone calls? The number is 617-830-4750. We are accepting all questions, comments, subjects, trolling, whatever. We don't know what's going to happen. Let's take our first call. Name and town. Where are you calling from?
Hello, David. Am I on?
You're on right now.
My name is Michael, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
All right. What's on your mind?
I was just wondering, since I know you're not too big of a Hillary supporter,
right,
but you just really don't want Donald Trump in, is there any Republican candidate that you would have supported?
I mean, if the question is, are there Republicans that exist that I'd consider voting for president, the answer is yes. If the question is, were there any of the 17 that ran this year that I would vote for over Hillary Clinton, I think the answer is no. I mean, is there anyone you would support?
Well, I mean, I probably have more of a hatred for Hillary than you. I would have gone with like Ted Cruz.
You would have supported Ted Cruz over Hillary. I mean, are you an evangelical Christian out of curiosity?
No, but I kind of align more with conservative values and just not too much of a fan of Trump.
Is there a particular issue on which you really like Ted Cruz's position, but not Hillary Clinton's?
I'm not too sure on Ted Cruz's positions on immigration right now, but that's the really gripe I have with Hillary.
So what don't you like about Hillary's immigration plan?
I think it's like the massive increase in refugee immigration and just like the recent leaks that came out on the open border stuff.
Okay, but so I think we've got to break it down piece by piece. Is there something so you don't want Syrian refugees coming into the U.S. at all?
Well, I mean, currently, since we have such a huge problem already with illegal Mexican immigration, I would just have an overall reduction in immigration.
Yeah, Mike, did you know, Mike, that more immigrants are going to Mexico from the U.S. than coming in? Did you know that there's a net outflow of Mexican immigrants currently?
Actually wasn't aware.
You weren't aware. All right. I would research that, Mike. It sounds like there's a lot there. I think you're doing a good job of trying to keep up with a lot of these issues, but I would check into some of the facts here and see if that changes your views at all. I do really appreciate the call. Check that net Mexican outflow number, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk again in the future. I do have to move on. We are taking phone calls at 617-830-4750. That's the number for callers. We will take any questions, comments, etc. I believe we have our next call. We do have our next call. Okay. Name and town. Who's on with us, and what do you want to talk about?
Oh, hi, David. First of all, I would like to say that I'm a big fan of your show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. And my name is Carlos Munoz-Kampf, and I would like to talk about immigration. And I'm an immigrant in the United States myself, and I believe that immigrants, when they move to a country, can actually spend money, buy education. And I myself actually am an entrepreneur, and I employ 4 people.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel really proud of that. And I have to say I've been really on edge with this whole election and really concerned about Donald Trump and his whole deportation force idea.
Yeah.
Not because it wouldn't affect me personally, like legally, I don't think, because I'm here legally.
Yeah. Are you an American citizen now, Carlos?
I have a green card.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think
so
you're fine. Yeah.
to an American citizen. Yeah. So yeah, but my concern is that the implications of having a deportation force, and that you'd need probably something like concentration camps and things like that. So my question is like, how can I think that the last push that the Trumps are going to try to put forward is going to be about immigration, especially since the Republican Party has somewhat left him. So I think that's going to be a big thing that he's going to.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Corruption.
If let's turn Carlos up just a tad, if we can, so I can hear him a little bit better. I think, Carlos, that this entire deportation force thing, even if Trump is elected, is not going to happen. I think if Trump were elected, after 4 years, he would claim to have had a deportation force. Really, what he'll just have is the system we have now, where there are circumstances where we have agencies here that enforce immigration law and deportations happen. There's record deportations happening under President Barack Obama. What country did you come to the U.S. from, out of curiosity?
I came from Brazil.
Okay. So I think that there is not going to be, number one, I mean, this is so insane that we're even getting into these details, but Trump's focus has not been Brazil, right? I mean, his focus has been Mexico and other sort of Central American Spanish-speaking countries that people are, as he says, coming in through Mexico, et cetera. I really don't think that there's, I think it would be insane in terms of what it would represent to have someone like Trump with the ideas he's espoused about immigration be president of the United States. But I'm convinced a lot of what he says would happen just won't. There won't be a deportation force, and the wall with Mexico, if it gets built partially, Mexico is absolutely not paying for it. So I share your concerns with the rhetoric. I don't think much of it will come to reality. Thanks so much for the call, Carlos. Really, really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we are going to move on. Very interesting to hear from Carlos. The number to call is 617-830-4750. Let's start with name and where you're calling from.
My name is Jason, and I'm calling from Dallas, Texas.
All right, Jason in Texas. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering your thoughts. Of course, you've had a lot of criticisms of Raza Aslan and other things, and you might even hear me flip-flop on this question. But for me, I have kind of a big split. I feel like there's a big split in the liberal base when it comes to the subject of Muslims. I am, of course, secular. I believe they should have the right to believe what they believe. Everyone should be able to believe what they want. But at the same time, of course, what a lot of Muslims are doing in the world.
Jason, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You cut out just for a second there, and let's turn Jason's volume up a little bit if we can. Just repeat that last part there.
It seems like, I'm not sure what my last part was, but, I'm for secularism, but sometimes it seems like Islam has an attack on secularism. So whenever you try and criticize Islam for being against secularism, you can be called a bigot or an Islamophobe, being attacked from the left. So I was kind of wondering your thoughts on that, sort of,
Yeah, listen, I mean, my thoughts on this are pretty, my thoughts are overarching and simple on this, which is anytime that there's sort of an identity-based defense or accusation of bias or discrimination, we should be skeptical of it and we should really examine it at its merits, right? And if what you're pointing out something that does exist, which is it attacks from Islam of non-believers as Islamophobic merely for saying, I oppose any country where you have some version of a religiously based law. And this might include making abortion illegal in the U.S. because Christians don't like it, or religious theocracies in the Middle East based on Islam, etc. There's no doubt that Islamophobia exists and is a problem. There's no doubt that Islamic extremism exists and is a problem. And there is no question whatsoever that people who say, hey, I'm not picking on any particular religion, I am for secularism, total separation of church and state. And people from different religions may attack that as discriminatory. I don't believe that it is. I think that if I look at any country and I say, I don't care what it is that the dominant religion is there, I believe that the religion should not be involved in any way in the day-to-day affairs of individuals and in government and in sort of civil law. That is a very clear ideological statement that would be unfair to interpret as being discriminatory to any particular religion. And I just think all you can really do if you're on the receiving end of that type of attack from Muslims or Christians or Jews or whoever is to just point out that what you insist that they explain what about the idea is discriminatory.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm wondering, though, what do you think about some of the division it's created? For example, I think a lot about that kind of argument that Bill Maher and Ben Affleck had a while back. That created a lot of division.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we've talked about that. I don't want to rehash that entire thing now, but I've talked about this split that exists, and we've thrown around the term regressive left, authoritarian left, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I've talked pretty extensively about that. I think the division is completely unproductive, but big picture, none of the fractures that have been created to the extent that they exist by this, none of those groups are going over to Republicans by and large. So I think it's mostly an internal issue that hopefully progressives can deal with head on. I do have to move on, Jason. I really appreciate the call from Texas. Hope you call back again. A very, very interesting and important issue. Let's take one more call if we have it. The number is 617-830-4750. Name and where you're calling from.
Hi, I'm Dan. I'm calling from Oregon.
Dan from Oregon. Pleasure having you on. What can we do for you today?
I'd like you to comment on the idea I've seen on the internet that the big corporations have kind of stolen, the governments and democracy and taken over. What do you think about that idea?
I mean, it's a very broad question. It could be approached a couple of different ways. Do big corporations have disproportionate lobbying power, immunity from following the laws as written, the ability to sort of create new infrastructures like what TPP would do with these transnational sort of jurisdictions for deciding on corporate malfeasance? Of course, the answer is yes, right? I mean, has Citizens United and the reductions on restrictions for donations given corporations disproportionate power? Of course, the answer is yes. I mean, then it becomes more conspiratorial, right? To what extent do individual CEOs manipulate elected officials? I mean, through lobbying, you can certainly make the case that the wants and desires of big corporations are having an impact in Washington. We know that when you look at the biggest contributors, you look at the industries that are the biggest contributors to elected officials, and then you see how legislation is regularly passed that is better for those types of businesses in particular industries that are big donors, oil, pharma, so many others, the insurance industry. How can you argue that corporations don't have a big and aggressive grasp on our government? I mean, is that the type of thing you're asking about?
Yes. Have we fallen into like a weird oligarchy thing, do you think? I mean, it's not as far as Alex Jones says, I don't think.
No, but we have.
Listen, you
might have Alex Jones way over here, and on the other side, you've got someone who thinks corporations have no power. There is a Princeton study which says we are effectively in an oligarchy in the United States. The policy desires and wishes of the rich and big corporations are disproportionately more likely to eventually make it into and become law in the United States. And that's just the reality. And the only way to explain that away without saying there's something wrong is to say, it's not that the rich and corporations are getting what they want because they donate a lot of money. They're getting what they want because they just have better ideas. And I think you and I, Dan, know that there can't possibly be truth to that in the grand scope, can there?
Yes, no, there can't.
All right. Very, very good.
Well, thanks for the answer.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, Dan from Oregon. Thanks so much for the call. That is going to do it for calls this week. We will take more calls next week. 617-830-4750 is the number to call. We'll take a break and be back with plenty more after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
For this week's classic interview, we will go back to May of 2014 when I interviewed Univision host Fernando Espuelas. And the topic was, how can Republicans gain minority votes? The context then was about the midterm election and more generally. I think that this interview really applies to what is going on now with the Republican Party. Trump implosion and disaster aside, there's this broader issue with the Republican Party that has been building for a long time, which is you can't rely overly on white voters because white voters are a smaller and smaller share of the electorate every election. And I talked with Fernando about, is it even possible for Republicans to make changes to attract minority voters? Let's think about this in the context of this upcoming election. I'm joined today by Fernando Espuelas. He's the host and managing editor of the Fernando Espuelas Show on Univision America Radio Network. It's great to have you on. I actually listen to your show, which isn't always the case, you know, with a lot of our guests. And it's really cool. You actually do your show partly in Spanish, partly in English. How do you decide which parts to do in which language?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me on your program. Our concept is that Latinos are predominantly now bilingual, and therefore we can go back and forth when it makes sense to do so, and we will not lose our audience. And in fact, that's what's happened. So what we do is we default Spanish, and because it's a Spanish language network. But when we have callers who are not comfortable speaking Spanish, we switch to English. Or when I'm interviewing a political figure, of which mostly they don't speak Spanish, we just switch into English. And that's basically the format. It totally depends on what we're talking about. And then there are moments when I forget Spanish for a moment, so I'll switch into English, and that seems to work okay as well.
Well, it's hugely interesting to me to do a show that is a political show that is mostly or at least part in Spanish, because the Hispanic vote is really becoming increasingly important and more of a topic of discussion going into the 2016 election and beyond. And I've talked about for years how there are demographic shifts at play in the U.S. right now that are going to make it really difficult for Republicans to continue the strategy of this over-reliance on the white vote. I mean, looking at 2016, Republicans, based on demographics, would need, it could be as much as 60 or 62% of the white vote if they don't gain some of the non-white vote. Where do you see this right now? And people you talk to, what is the primary issue that is keeping Hispanic voters away from voting for Republicans, with the exception, of course, of Cuban Americans, which are the most conservative of the different Hispanic groups in the U.S.?
Well, I think that I agree with your basic math that it's increasingly hard to see how Republicans win the White House without attracting a much bigger percentage of the minority vote in general, including African Americans, including Asian Americans. But certainly the Hispanic vote is a critical component because it is, although it's underrepresented in the voting, the overall numbers of potential voters is huge, and it's growing by 50,000 kids who turn 18 every single month. So the issue, I think it's a policy issue. I think that the Republican Party has shrunk to now be primarily an older. Obviously, there are other people who vote for them, but generally speaking, that's who it is. And they've appealed to this electorate primarily through a strategy of fear. In 2009, if you remember, the Tea Party movement, which was essentially created by consultants in Washington and then funded by some big money interest, a lot of their messaging was give our country back, give us our country back. And then bizarre depictions of Obama as either both a Nazi and a communist, with no apparent irony involved. So I think that the overall demographic change of the country is a factor. I think having an African-American president is a factor. I think that the Tea Party moving the center of gravity of the Republican Party to the far right is a factor. And at the end of the day, what's happened, I believe, is that Republicans are in favor of immigration reform if you look at national polling. But when you get into the congressional party, which has been gerrymandered into these perfectly hermetically sealed, homogenous congressional districts mostly, That electorate may not only not want immigration reform, may feel threatened by it, and certainly the politicians have exploited that fear with a tremendous cascade of lies about illegals and they're robbing your job and they're criminals and so forth and so on. So I think that the problem is that the Republican Party does not have today, it seems, the will to fundamentally evolve its positions. They've lost 5 out of the 6 last elections in terms of popular vote. That's probably a signal that your program is not a program that can attract a national majority. But they go through this process where they decide they have to change, and when it comes to having to change, they default on essentially a messaging problem. We have a messaging problem. But it's not a messaging problem. When you have Mitt Romney in 2012 running on this, essentially this the harshest policy possible, self-deportation, old ladies and children out, will make their lives impossible until they leave. I'm an American citizen. It doesn't impact me. There's no one in my family who's impacted by a reform, but I was highly insulted by that rhetoric. And certainly the premise that you would be able to attract supporters, not just among Hispanics, but among Americans, independents and center Republicans, to what is, a vaguely 1930s policy of displacement of 12 million people. I mean, it just makes no sense.
I think that there may also be another factor at play here. Always lurking in the background of all of these positions is the effect on fundraising, right? Because fundraising, because of our how elections are financed here, our fundraising is at the forefront. Is it possible that Republicans realize that they need to change their positions on immigration, maybe adopting something closer to what Jeb Bush talked about recently, saying, it's just not really feasible to say we're going to deport everybody. We should institute some kind of path to citizenship. But at the same time, they realize that their base, which is very much against anything even resembling amnesty, may stop donating money to them if they adopt that policy.
I'm not sure that's because the party, from my perspective anyway, seems to be divided among the grassroots, which are primarily blue class workers, older, downscale, lower education levels, and then the so-called establishment, which are primarily business interests. And the business interests, like, for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which has been essentially an annex of the Republican Party for decades, they're completely in favor of immigration reform. And why? Because it's very beneficial to business. And I think if you pull back, what is immigration reform? Forget the emotions. It is a fundamental shift in how we have to structure our country in order to be competitive for the next 100 years. If you just were to freeze magically the population that is in the country today, no more immigrants, legal, illegal, it doesn't matter. You would, in fact, have a declining population about 30 years from now. Said in another way, we would have a declining national economy, political structure, but our ability to project power internationally would go away. I mean, there are a lot of really fundamental issues here that immigration addresses. And then you can go up and down the scale. You can go to Silicon Valley and how, that engine of tremendous innovation really requires lots of immigrants. That we want to be able to hoover up the best minds in the world and have them come here without all the hassle, or if they're coming to our universities, to have them stay here. And then all the way on the other side of the labor market, the reality of it is, and this was put to the test in Alabama with the anti-immigrant law there, and Georgia the same way, that without immigrants who are essentially willing to do some very hard work that other people are not willing to do, the agricultural sector suffers tremendously. And then there's everyone else in the middle, right? So I think the issue ultimately is about ideology more than money, and I think that it's impossible, seemingly, at least that's what Romney experienced, to win the Republican nomination without taking this extremist position. And let's remember, Mitt Romney, of all the people on planet Earth who he could have picked to be his immigration advisor, he picked Chris Kobosh, who was the author of the Alabama anti-immigrant law, the Arizona anti-immigrant law, who has been writing voter ID laws to exclude Hispanics, and who can be traced to a group of white supremacist organizations. No, I'm not exaggerating. If you look at John Tanton, the John Tanton Network, there's a great New York Times piece that's worth reading, where it actually puts out all these huge groups of supposedly independent activists who are in fact all connected behind one strategy, which is to stop all immigration into this country. So, I mean, that was Mitt Romney's choice, and I think that whatever else you think about his politics, I don't think in fact, I think he's a very smart man, but at the end of the day, in order to get even close to winning the nomination, he had to assume some of these positions, which were ultimately completely unpalatable to, well, Hispanics certainly, but Asian Americans. They lost the Asian American vote by even a bigger margin than the Hispanic vote.
Fernando Espuelas show on Univision American Radio Network. What's the best way for people around the country to listen to your show?
Well, if you have a Univision America station in your city, that's one way. But probably the best way is to listen online. You can listen to my show live on Euphoria, which is an app, a Univision app you can download for whatever phone platform. You can also listen to iHeartRadio online, and also UnivisionAmerica.com streams the show as well. It's on from 2 to 4 Eastern time, Monday through Friday, and then it's all across the country.
Excellent. Fernando, you're from Uruguay. I'm from Argentina. I'm very excited for the World Cup, which is going to be happening soon. How are things looking for your country this time around?
Well, I think I'm the one Uruguayan who does not follow soccer. So
so you'll root for Argentina then?
I'm going to root for the United States and Uruguay as well, and Argentina. I mean, at the end of the day, I learned early on that I will not attach my emotions to a bunch of guys who may or may not win, and I cannot control. So I'm not into the heartbreak experience of the World Cup, but I certainly will watch the finals.
All right, Fernando, really a pleasure having you on. Thanks for doing it.
Thank you, David. A pleasure being with you. Thanks for inviting me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's answer some questions. Always great to answer audience questions on Friday. You can email them in. Leave them as a voicemail at 219-2-DAVID-P. Tweet audience questions to us. Post them on Facebook. Post them on Reddit. Whatever you want, we'll take the audience questions. The first one is from Nate. Nate says, hey, would you be willing to become extremely ugly physically if it allowed you to live for 1,000 years at any physical age that you chose? My instinct is that this is not a tough question. I would say yes. I mean, I think that if I could live 1,000 years at my current age, roughly my current age and health and whatever, assuming the entire fainting on planes thing gets the all clear, which we're going in that direction. But yes, assuming that, I think that the answer would be yes. I think in 1,000 years, I'd be able to figure out how to surpass any impediment I might have from being extremely ugly physically. And that what I would learn from living 1,000 years in good health and seeing what's 1,000 years away into the future, for me, it's a pretty easy yes. I don't know. Usually these are really tough where I say, on the one hand, but on the other hand, but I think this is a yes for me.
Plus, how ugly are we talking here? I mean, I think that has to be defined a little bit. Can I go out during the day still?
Right. Yeah. I mean, are we talking, I don't want to say anything, we don't want to maybe give specific examples, but are we talking about horrible disfigurement to the point where you may not even be comfortable leaving your house, or just like a still within the normal scope, but just basically as ugly as a sort of general person might be? I don't even know what words I should be using here. I'm sort of taking the question as it's written. My instinct is that if I can leave the house during the day without creating chaos on the streets, that my curiosity about the future is significant enough that I would accept this trade.
Yeah, I think we're going to differ here. I don't think I'd want to live for 1,000 years. I mean,
really?
Maybe 100 to 200 should be enough, I think.
Enough
but I
for
guess,
what, though?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I guess you're not ailing, you're not aging as you would normally.
Right.
You're going to be stuck at the same age. But I mean, I think 100, 200 years, that's about enough.
But I am interested in this concept of enough to do, because enough suggests enough to accomplish X, Y, or Z, right? So 100 or 200 years would be enough for what?
For just the full happy life, I think. I think that would be the right amount of time.
So you're less curious about what our planet would be like in 1,000 years.
I'm actually kind of worried.
Well,
I mean,
of course,
with climate change going the way
I'm
it is
worried
now,
too.
I mean, could we even support life that far down the road?
It's said that we're at this point of hugely accelerating development and advancement in terms of technology and whatever, and feeling that we're on the cusp of that. I don't know if my current natural lifespan will really get me far enough to see some of the incredible things that will no doubt be around in 400 or 500 years. And that's really where my genuine curiosity would make me think that this is if it were a deal with the devil that I'd be striking, that it would be an interesting one to me. I guess for some people that's not as interesting.
Plus, if you're guaranteed 1,000 years, that means you kind of have some immunity. Like you can just jump off buildings and be completely invincible. I
understand. Whenever I hear about if your lifespan would become 1,000 years, I don't see that as immortality. Like you could still be run over by a bus. I still see it as if you don't suffer a catastrophic accident or something like that, your lifespan could allow you to live 1,000 years because you're going more into like you're immortal. You could step in front of a bus and you would just bounce off and be fine. Which I guess, I mean, we're in a fantasy world no matter what. It's just your fantasy world versus my fantasy world. But I assume that you would still be susceptible to sort of getting hit by a meteor or something like that.
Sure. Well, you can live your 1,000 years and let me know how it goes.
All right. So that's my answer. I don't know if people have... Am I just not considering something that would make me change my answer? Let me know. Andrea wrote in saying, people often have opinions about things they know little about. Are there any things in particular that really bother you when someone opines without any clue? For whatever reason, like diet and medical stuff, I get pretty irritated when people just say completely matter-of-factly in black and white terms, X or Y about medical or diet stuff when they really don't know about it or haven't researched it. I mean, certainly I encounter a lot of people who, because of what I do, want to talk about politics with me. And I guess I sort of find it annoying when people regurgitate something as fact that they're actually completely clueless about, but are convinced that they know about. But I'm sort of used to that because a lot of the guests we interview seem to have that exact same problem. Also, the other one I find annoying, and this is, I'm not a parent, so I don't know exactly why it strikes a chord with me, but when people give parenting advice in a completely definitive black and white way, like they know what the right thing is to do, they tell another parent, you're doing the wrong thing. And often they don't really have a clue about anything. That one bothers me. And I am not someone who is a parent or ever really had any particular experiences where someone tried telling me what to do and then my parents said, no, he's our son or whatever. I don't have any particular experience from history that would make me particularly triggered or reactive to that. But that I find really pretty annoying. Those are a few. I don't know if you have any, Pat, where like when you hear some opinion or people comment and you recognize they don't know anything, that it really angers you in particular.
Well, politics is a big one, and you touched on it, because regardless of how educated you are, you can still have an opinion. You're still entitled to that. So when you're someone who like follows the news and is like well educated in the subject matter, and you're kind of up against someone who just is regurgitating talking points that they've heard on CNN, I mean, that can be awfully frustrating.
I think along these same lines, attitudes towards mental illness and poverty and homelessness that are completely disconnected from the real world. People are only poor because they just haven't decided to stop being poor yet, and everybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Factually untrue. Many people live their entire lives with limited empathy for people who are poor or homeless because they just think everybody who's poor or homeless, A, deserves it, and or B, could change it at any time. It's just not true. And
or
that
addicted
really,
to some kind of drug, too. You can throw that in there, too.
And absolutely. And mental illness and drug addiction as not being considered as serious as just like a physical illness. You usually don't blame people for having diabetes. Maybe it's a bad example because depending on what type of diabetes you're talking to, it can be related to diet. But in the same way that it's weird to be angry at someone because they get the flu, being angry at someone because they're mentally ill or not reacting in sort of an empathetic, sympathetic way. And the same thing as far as poverty goes. People who are mean to poor people or homeless people, I truly just don't understand that. And it really rubs me the wrong way.
And they could be well-meaning, too.
Sure.
They could just be too simplistic in how they phrase things, and it gets interpreted as them just being insensitive.
Absolutely. So I think those are a few of them. And then also, I mean, just on a personal note, when people come to me knowing nothing about journalism or the production of programs and tell me exactly what it is that I should be doing, I welcome all advice from everybody in what I do. Anybody, I don't care how educated you are. I don't care who you are. I don't care about any identity particulars. If you come to me with an idea about the show, I'm absolutely interested and willing to listen. What I don't like is when people come to me and with absolutely no knowledge or basis for these beliefs at all, tell me in black and white terms, X that I'm doing is wrong and Y is how I should be doing it. And they're absolutely clueless. And I sort of try to explain to them why something's not practical or realistic. They don't care. They're right. They know, although they've never sat in front of a camera, spoken in front of a microphone, been around a camera, been around anything journalism related, etc., and are defiant in that they know, but I don't know. That can be pretty annoying. Last question today is from Ray. Ray says, hey, David, have you met people who are just really off-putting or mean for no apparent reason? How do you deal with them? You know, my view on this has really changed over time. When I was younger and I would meet someone that was just really off-putting, overly aggressive, mean, I would often have very, very negative reactions about the person. And I would sort of immediately dislike the person and feel anger or resentment and really sort of go in a way where when they say something that is off-putting or mean, try to match that and respond in kind. But over the years, I've sort of realized that it's very rare that there's genuinely bad people. And for the most part, when somebody is off-putting or mean or very arrogant or aggressive in social situations, I actually kind of feel bad because it usually is indicative of the fact that they're either really insecure or it could lead from having been neglected as kids, and this is how they sort of seek attention and validation. They could have something going on in their life where they've experienced a loss, could be a breakup, could be a death in the family, whatever. And this is an attitude that they're sort of taking for self-protection. I don't know, Pat. I mean, over time, I'm much more sympathetic to people like that. And I say, you know, something really tough must be going on for someone to show up. And recently I had someone show up in a group of people. They knew a couple of the people, they didn't know me. And they were just very off-putting, very dismissive and condescending and whatever. If they're feeling the need to do that, it's probably representative of some issue they have going on. And it doesn't really have anything to do with wanting to attack me.
Plus, it's important to point out where we live too, which is Boston, and this city gets the reputation of being awfully aggressive. Yeah. And when you come across someone who is just overly aggressive and off-putting, I guess, as the question's phrased, it's hard not to match their level. Totally. And
Lewis told some stories of dealing with litterers on the way to the studio, and he would choose to get pretty aggressive. And I don't know if littering could be you just don't care about your surroundings, but littering also could be because of how you grew up. You just don't really think about tossing your Dunkin' Donuts cup or Starbucks cup or whatever on the ground because you grew up in a situation where maybe the trash was dealt with in that way. I don't know. So I try not to be too reactive, and generally speaking, I'm not the type to escalate situations. So I am not going to be the one who says, who do you think you are talking to me in that way? You know, it's just, I try to just play it cool. If this is not someone that I want to be around, then I just can quietly not participate in conversation with these people. That's usually my move. I don't know how you react around people like that.
Yeah, just keep the conversation short, only say what you need to, and go about your day.
I totally agree with you. And I know there are people in the audience, at least from what they claim when they email me, who often take very aggressive approaches when they are confronted with an opinion they don't like and whatever. I'd be curious to hear, has that ever led to anything positive? Because in my more aggressive youthful days, rarely when I would come back at aggression with aggression, would I ever really accomplish anything? Rarely would I change any minds. Rarely would I achieve someone changing their demeanor towards me. It just didn't really make any sense. And I think I learned from that pretty early on. We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. davidpakman.com/bonus show is how you sign up, get instant access, and of course, that's the #1 funding source for the program. So I would really encourage you, if you like the work we do, you want to support independent media, sign up at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.